They tied the German Shepherd to the back of the police car and said it was for public safety. But the man standing there knew it was a lie, because he saw the way they smiled when no one was watching. 10 minutes later, the dog was locked in a dark shed behind the station. And the man who tried to protect him was sitting in handcuffs, accused of crimes he never committed. They thought he was just another stranger passing through. They did not know he had spent his life surviving places much worse than this town. And they definitely did not know that tonight, everything they had hidden was about to come into the light. Red Creek lay under a wide, pale sky, the kind that seemed too big for such a small town. The late afternoon sun sat low and harsh, flattening shadows against cracked pavement and rusted metal signs. Dry wind pushed dust along the roadside in thin, restless lines, carrying with it the smell of gasoline, old tires, and distant livestock. The town looked quiet but not peaceful, more like it was holding its breath. Graham Pierce drove in without hurry, his dark pickup rolling past weathered storefronts and boarded windows that spoke of businesses long gone. He parked near the only diner still open on Main Street and cut the engine, resting his hands on the steering wheel for a brief moment as his eyes took in the street. Graham was 38, tall and broad through the shoulders, built like someone who had carried weight for most of his adult life. His hair was cut short on the sides, slightly longer on top, black threaded with silver at the temples. His face was lean, marked by quiet lines around the eyes and mouth, not from smiling, but from years of sun and focus. He wore a dark flannel shirt over a gray t-shirt, faded jeans, and old combat boots that had been resoled more than once. He did not look dangerous, but he looked alert, in a way that suggested he noticed more than most people did. When he opened the passenger door, a large German Shepherd stepped out with controlled precision. Atlas was around 6 or 7, tall and muscular, his black and tan coat thick and glossy despite the dust that clung to his legs. One ear stood perfectly upright, while the tip of the other bent slightly forward, giving him a look of permanent attention. There was a faint scar hidden in the fur along his left flank, the remnant of an old injury that had healed clean but never fully disappeared. His eyes were dark and steady, tracking the street with calm awareness. Atlas did not pull on the leash or wander. He waited for Graham to move first, then followed at his side, close enough that their shadows touched. They walked toward the diner, and Graham felt the familiar sense of being noticed, not with curiosity, but with caution. A man sitting on the steps of a closed hardware store stopped mid-conversation when he saw them pass. 2 women near a laundromat window lowered their voices. No one stared openly, but their eyes lingered long enough for Graham to catch it. He had seen that look before in other places, the look people wore when they were not sure who could be trusted. Inside the diner, the air was cooler and smelled faintly of coffee and fried onions. The room was small, with vinyl booths along the walls and a counter lined with stools that had lost most of their shine. A radio played softly near the kitchen door, some country song about roads and regret. Behind the counter stood Evelyn Hart, a woman in her mid-50s with strong shoulders and silver-brown hair pulled into a loose bun. Her face was lined but kind, and her eyes carried the sharp attentiveness of someone who had spent years watching people, not out of suspicion, but out of care. She wore a pale blue apron over a dark blouse, and when she smiled, it reached her eyes, though there was a guarded edge beneath it. "Seat wherever you like," Evelyn said, her voice steady and warm. "Coffee's fresh." Graham nodded and guided Atlas to the booth near the window. Atlas lay down at his feet without being told, folding his long legs carefully, head resting near Graham's boot. A few patrons glanced over, some with interest, others with unease, but no one commented. Evelyn poured coffee and set the mug in front of Graham, then paused briefly, her gaze dropping to Atlas. "He's a fine-looking dog," she said. "Well trained." Graham met her eyes. He had good teachers. She gave a small nod, as if that answered more than the word suggested, and returned to the counter. Graham took a sip of coffee and listened to the room. Forks clinked against plates. Someone coughed. The radio crackled slightly between songs. Everything felt normal, almost ordinary, and yet there was a tension that sat just under the surface, like a wire pulled too tight. The tension sharpened when the patrol car rolled past the diner window. It moved slowly, not in a hurry to be anywhere, the engine louder than necessary in the quiet street. Graham did not turn to look, but Atlas lifted his head, ears angling toward the sound. Through the glass, Graham caught a glimpse of the driver, a thick-necked man in uniform with one arm resting out the open window. His gaze swept the street, then lingered briefly on the diner before moving on. Conversation inside the diner dipped for a moment, then resumed in lower tones. A man at the counter shifted on his stool, shoulders stiff. A teenage boy in the back booth pretended to focus on his phone, though his eyes flicked toward the window again and again. Evelyn's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as she refilled a cup near the register. That teenage boy was Mason Hart, Evelyn's son, 18 and tall, still growing into his limbs. His hair was light brown and always a little messy, like he had just run his hands through it and forgotten to smooth it back down. He wore a hoodie despite the heat, sleeves pushed up, revealing thin wrists and fingers that never quite seemed to stop moving. Mason had the restless energy of someone who paid attention to everything but pretended not to care. He glanced at Graham and Atlas, then at the window, then back at his phone, where the screen glowed but showed nothing of interest. The patrol car passed out of sight, but the unease it left behind stayed. Graham felt it in the way people avoided looking at each other, in the way no one laughed too loudly, in the way even the radio seemed quieter than before. He had not planned to stay long, just long enough to eat, refuel, and keep moving, but something about the room told him this town was not just tired. It was afraid. Evelyn brought a plate of food to Graham's table, meatloaf and mashed potatoes, steam rising gently. "On the house," she said quietly. "You look like you've been driving a while." Graham studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Thank you." She hesitated, then spoke again, her voice lower. "That car you saw, they tend to take their time around here." "Is that so?" Graham asked, keeping his tone neutral. Evelyn gave a small, careful shrug. "They like to remind folks they're around." Before Graham could respond, the diner door opened, letting in a gust of hot air and dust. The same patrol car had stopped outside, and now the driver stepped in. Deputy Caleb Dorn was in his early 40s, thick through the chest and arms, his uniform stretched tight across his shoulders. His hair was cropped short, nearly shaved, and his face was broad with a permanent hint of a smirk that never quite reached his eyes. Those eyes were small and sharp, always searching for something to push against. Dorn's gaze swept the room and landed on Graham almost immediately, then dropped to Atlas. The corner of his mouth lifted slightly, not in amusement, but in interest. He walked to the counter, boots heavy against the tile, and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the surface as if he owned it. "Afternoon, Evelyn," he said. "Busy day?" "Same as always, Deputy," Evelyn replied, keeping her voice even. Her hands did not stop moving as she wiped the counter, but Graham noticed the way her shoulders stiffened. Dorn turned his head just enough to look directly at Graham. "Haven't seen you around before," he said. "Passing through?" "Yes," Graham answered simply. Dorn's eyes flicked down to Atlas. "That's a big dog you've got there." "He's well behaved," Graham said. Dorn chuckled softly. "They all are, until they're not." Mason shifted in his seat, his phone now in his hand for real, thumb hovering as if uncertain what to do with it. A woman near the door picked up her purse and stood, murmuring something about needing to go. The air in the diner felt heavier, the way it did before a storm. Evelyn cleared her throat. "Deputy, if you need something, I can—" "I'm just making conversation," Dorn said, cutting her off, though his smile never reached his eyes. He straightened and took a step toward Graham's booth, his gaze still fixed on Atlas. "Town's been quiet lately. We like to keep it that way." Graham did not move. Atlas remained still, but his muscles tensed slightly, a subtle shift only someone who knew him well would notice. Dorn's smile thinned. "Enjoy your meal," he said at last, then turned and walked out, letting the door swing shut behind him with a sharp jingle of the bell. No one spoke for several seconds after he left. Then conversation resumed in cautious fragments, as if people were afraid that speaking too freely might bring him back. Evelyn let out a breath she had clearly been holding and glanced toward Graham, something like apology in her eyes. Graham looked down at Atlas and rested a hand briefly on the dog's head, feeling the steady warmth beneath his palm. He lifted his gaze to the window, watching the patrol car pull away slowly, deliberately, like it was not done reminding the town who was in charge. Whatever Red Creek had become, it was not by accident, and Graham knew, even then, that his stop here was not going to be as brief as he had planned. The heat had thickened by the time Graham and Atlas left the diner, the sun hanging low enough to glare off windshields and bleach color from the street. Red Creek felt smaller outside, its single main road stretching quiet and exposed, with nowhere to hide from curious eyes. Graham walked toward the gas station across the street, Atlas moving beside him with the same steady discipline, his paws kicking up small clouds of dust with each step. The station was old, its pumps faded to a dull red, the concrete beneath them cracked and stained by decades of spilled fuel. A single pickup was parked near the far pump, its owner nowhere in sight. Inside the station office, a woman stood behind the counter, counting bills with practiced speed. Her name was Sarah Miller, though the name tag pinned to her shirt had lost most of its ink. She was in her early 40s, tall and thin, with dark hair pulled into a tight ponytail and eyes that rarely rested in one place for long. There was a guardedness about her, the kind that came from living in a place where saying the wrong thing to the wrong person could cost more than pride. She glanced up when Graham entered, offering a polite but cautious nod. "Pump's working," she said. "Sometimes takes a second to read the card." "Thanks," Graham replied. He stepped back outside, swiping his card and beginning to fill the tank, while Atlas settled on the shaded side of the truck, lying down with his head up, alert but calm. A light breeze stirred the loose papers near the station wall, carrying with it the faint hum of insects and the distant bark of a dog from somewhere beyond the fields. For a brief moment, the town felt almost ordinary again. The patrol car returned before the tank was half full. It rolled into the station lot slowly, tires crunching over gravel, stopping just short of the pumps. Deputy Caleb Dorn stepped out, adjusting his belt as if he had all the time in the world. In the open light, his broad frame looked even heavier, his arms thick with muscle that came more from intimidation than work. His face held the same thin smile from earlier, and his eyes went straight to Atlas. "Well now," Dorn said, his voice carrying easily across the open space. "Didn't think you'd be sticking around." Graham kept his focus on the pump, though his body shifted slightly, placing himself between Dorn and Atlas without making it obvious. "Just getting gas," he said. Dorn walked closer, stopping a few feet away, close enough that Graham could smell tobacco on his breath. He glanced down at Atlas, then back at Graham. "That dog of yours," he said. "Real disciplined. Military, maybe?" Graham did not answer. Dorn shrugged and bent down, pretending to inspect the ground near Atlas. With a quick flick of his fingers, he picked up a small piece of gravel and tossed it across the concrete, letting it skid and bounce near the dog's nose. Atlas's ears snapped forward and his body tensed, a low sound rising in his chest before Graham spoke. "Easy," Graham said quietly. Atlas held, muscles tight but unmoving. Dorn straightened, eyes narrowing slightly. "See that?" he said, loud enough for Sarah to hear through the open office window. "That right there, aggressive behavior." "He hasn't moved," Graham replied. Dorn bent again, this time dragging the toe of his boot against the concrete, scraping loudly just inches from Atlas's face. Atlas flinched, teeth flashing for a split second as a warning, a sound slipping from his throat before he could stop it. It was not a lunge, not an attack, just instinct. Dorn stepped back dramatically, hand going to his radio. "That's enough! I warned you!" Graham's hand closed into a fist at his side, then relaxed. "You provoked him," he said. "You know that." Dorn's smile widened, satisfied. "Town ordinance, dog shows aggression toward an officer, animal control gets called, for everyone's safety." He spoke into his radio, calling in a report that sounded official enough, though Graham could hear the eagerness beneath it. Sarah stood frozen in the doorway, her face pale, eyes darting between Dorn and Atlas. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, fear winning over protest. Across the street, Mason had stepped out of the diner, pretending to check something on his phone. From the shadow of the building, he lifted the device slightly, angling it toward the gas station. His hands shook, but he kept the camera steady, eyes fixed on the screen rather than the men in front of him. Mason had always been observant, more comfortable watching than speaking, and growing up in Red Creek had taught him that evidence mattered more than opinions. Graham crouched beside Atlas, placing a firm hand on the dog's neck, feeling the rapid beat of his heart beneath the thick fur. "Stay," he whispered. Atlas's eyes locked onto Graham's, the tension in his body easing just enough to obey. Dorn watched the exchange, irritation flickering across his face as if annoyed that he was not getting the reaction he wanted. "You should have kept him under better control," he said. "Wouldn't want something bad to happen to him." Graham stood slowly, meeting Dorn's gaze. "If anything happens to him," he said, "it won't be because he's dangerous." Dorn leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Around here, things happen because I say they do." The distant wail of a siren broke the moment, not urgent, just the steady sound of a vehicle approaching. Animal Control's white truck appeared at the far end of the street, turning into the station lot with a cloud of dust. The driver stepped out, a short man in his late 50s with thinning hair and tired eyes. His name was Harold Finch, and he had worked Animal Control in Red Creek for nearly 20 years. He carried himself like someone who had learned not to ask questions if he wanted to keep his job. "What's the situation, Deputy?" Harold asked, adjusting the cap on his head. "Dog showed aggression toward an officer," Dorn said. "Needs to be taken in. Observation period. Standard procedure." Harold glanced at Atlas, then at Graham, hesitation clear on his face. "He doesn't look." "Do your job," Dorn cut in. Harold sighed softly and reached for the leash hanging from his belt. Graham stepped forward. "You don't have to do this," he said to Harold. He was provoked. Harold's eyes met his for a brief second, something like regret passing through them. "I know," he murmured, "but I don't get to decide that." He moved carefully, slowly, speaking in a low, gentle voice as he clipped the leash onto Atlas's collar. Atlas looked back at Graham, confusion and trust mixing in his eyes, his tail lowering as he allowed himself to be led toward the truck. Graham followed a step behind, every instinct urging him to stop it, but he forced himself to stay still. Violence here would only give Dorn exactly what he wanted. Mason zoomed in on his phone, capturing Harold loading Atlas into the back of the truck, the metal door closing with a hollow clang that made his stomach twist. He swallowed hard, keeping the camera rolling even as his hands trembled. Dorn folded his arms, watching with open satisfaction. "You're free to go," he told Graham, "but your dog stays until we're sure he's not a threat." Graham said nothing. He watched the truck pull away, dust rising behind it, Atlas's shape barely visible through the small barred window. When it disappeared around the corner, Graham turned back to Dorn, his face unreadable. "This isn't over," Dorn said quietly, his smile thin and sharp. "Not for you." Graham held his gaze for a long moment, then turned away, walking back toward his truck. Across the street, Mason lowered his phone, heart pounding, knowing he had just recorded something that could get him in serious trouble, but also knowing he could not unsee what had happened. Red Creek went quiet again, but the silence felt different now, heavier, as if the town itself knew a line had been crossed. The animal control truck turned off the main road and followed a narrow service lane behind the police station, where the buildings grew older and more neglected with every few yards. The back of the station faced a patch of cracked asphalt and several rusted sheds that had once been used to store confiscated property. Atlas stood inside the metal cage in the truck, legs braced as it slowed, ears pulled back, eyes scanning for Graham, even as unfamiliar smells filled the air. When the truck stopped, Harold Finch climbed out, his shoulders slumped in a way that suggested he had carried too many quiet regrets in this job. He opened the rear door carefully, clipped the leash to Atlas's collar, and led him toward the nearest shed without meeting the dog's eyes. Inside the shed, the light was dim and uneven, coming from a single bulb that flickered faintly above rows of dusty shelves. A temporary kennel made of chain-link panels stood in the corner, its floor bare concrete, stained and cold. Above the door, a small security camera hung at an angle, its lens clouded with grime, its indicator light dark. No one had bothered to repair it in a long time. Harold guided Atlas inside and secured the leash to a metal ring bolted into the wall. He placed a bowl of water near the fence, hesitated, then turned and shut the door, the metal latch clicking loudly in the quiet space. Atlas stood still for a moment, then slowly lowered himself to the floor, his breathing uneven, head lifted toward the door that had just closed. Not far away, inside the police station, Graham was led down a narrow hallway by Deputy Caleb Dorn. The walls were painted a dull beige, chipped in places where years of boots and equipment had scraped past. The smell of disinfectant mixed with old coffee lingered in the air. Graham's hands were free, but Dorn's presence at his side made it clear that freedom was only temporary. They stopped at a small office with a metal desk and 2 chairs. Dorn gestured toward one of them without looking at Graham. "Just routine," Dorn said. "Verification. Won't take long if you cooperate." Graham sat, his posture straight, eyes steady. "I want to know where my dog is." Dorn leaned against the desk, arms crossed. "He's being held for observation. That's all you need to know right now." Dorn stepped out of the room, closing the door behind him. Graham listened to the sounds of movement in the hallway, the low murmur of voices, the clink of keys. He knew this kind of waiting, the deliberate pause meant to unsettle, to make a person feel small and uncertain. He kept his breathing slow and even, refusing to let the silence work on him. Minutes later, Dorn returned, carrying a thin folder. He set it on the desk, but did not open it. "So," he said, "you driving through Red Creek with no fixed address, no local contacts, and a vehicle that's been spotted near some places we're keeping an eye on." "That's not true," Graham replied. "I stopped for food and gas." "That's it." Dorn's smile was slight and humorless. "Funny thing about reports, they don't have to be perfect. They just have to sound good enough." He flipped the folder open, revealing forms and notes that Graham had never seen before. Vehicle descriptions, partial license numbers, locations that meant nothing to him. Graham recognized the tactic immediately. The papers were meant to create a story where none existed. "You're suggesting I'm involved in moving illegal goods," Graham said. "I'm suggesting we need to look into it," Dorn replied. "Until we're sure, you're going to stay in town." Dorn closed the folder and left again, locking the door behind him. Graham leaned back slightly in the chair, jaw tightening. This was no longer about Atlas. It was about making sure Graham had no leverage, no easy way to push back. Behind the station, the shed door opened again. This time, Dorn stepped inside alone. Atlas lifted his head at once, ears angling forward, body tense. Dorn did not speak. He walked up to the kennel fence and struck it sharply with his baton, the sound echoing through the small space. Atlas flinched and backed away, claws scraping against the concrete as he retreated into the corner. Dorn struck the fence again, closer to the dog's face, not hitting him directly, but close enough that the vibration rattled through the metal. "That's what happens when you don't behave," Dorn said quietly. Atlas's breathing grew fast and shallow, his body pressed tight against the chain link, eyes wide, but still tracking every movement. He did not snap or lunge. He did not try to break free. He simply endured, muscles trembling, confusion and fear replacing the calm discipline he had shown all day. Across the lot, Mason crouched behind a stack of old pallets, his heart pounding so hard he was sure someone would hear it. He had followed the animal control truck on his bike, staying out of sight, driven by a feeling he could not ignore. From where he hid, he could see into the open shed door just enough to know what was happening. He lifted his phone, hands shaking, and began recording. The image was grainy but clear enough. Dorn, the baton, the terrified dog in the corner. Mason swallowed hard, forcing himself to keep the camera steady. His face was pale, freckles standing out sharply, but his eyes were focused and determined. He had grown up in Red Creek watching adults look the other way when things felt wrong. He had promised himself he would not be one of them. Inside the station, Graham was still alone when the door finally opened again. Sheriff Wade Ketter stood in the doorway, his posture straight, uniform immaculate, his gray hair neatly combed back. He was a tall man with a calm, controlled presence, the kind that made people listen without realizing why. His eyes moved over Graham with practiced assessment. "Mr. Pierce," Ketter said, "we just need to clear up a few concerns." "Then start by releasing my dog," Graham replied. Ketter's expression did not change. "That won't be happening yet. We have to follow procedure." "What procedure involves fabricating evidence?" Graham asked, "and threatening someone's property to keep them quiet." Ketter studied him for a moment, then gave a faint, almost regretful shake of his head. "You're in no position to make accusations." He turned and left, and Graham understood that whatever was happening in Red Creek went far beyond one deputy with a temper. This was organized, protected, and confident that no one would interfere. Outside, Mason ended the recording and backed away from the pallets, his hands still shaking. He knew exactly who he had to contact. His uncle, Trevor Miles, had left Red Creek years ago and joined a federal agency. Trevor was a tall, broad man with dark hair going gray at the edges, known in the family for being stubborn and thorough, the kind who followed problems until they were finished. Mason opened his messages, attached the video, and typed a short line telling him where it was filmed. His thumb hovered for a moment, then he sent it. The message left his phone quietly, without ceremony, but Mason felt like he had just crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. By the time Graham was released from the office, the light outside had begun to fade, long shadows stretching across the parking lot. Dorn escorted him to the front door, his expression unreadable. "You're free to go for now," Dorn said. "But don't think about leaving town. We're still checking your story." Graham stepped outside, the cooler evening air brushing against his face. He turned back once, looking at the station, knowing Atlas was still somewhere behind those walls, alone in a dark shed with no one to protect him. And beyond the limits of Red Creek, a video was already making its way to someone who would not ignore it. Night settled over Red Creek slowly, the heat of the day giving way to cooler air that carried the smell of dry grass and dust. The street lights flickered on one by one, casting uneven pools of yellow across empty sidewalks. Graham walked back toward the diner, his steps steady, his thoughts fixed on the dark shed behind the police station where Atlas had been left. Every instinct urged him to go back there, but he knew now that anything he did alone would only tighten the net around both of them. Inside the diner, the room was nearly empty. A single trucker sat at the counter, nursing coffee, while Evelyn wiped down tables with slow, distracted movements. Her shoulders sagged with the kind of tired that came from worry rather than work. When she saw Graham, she straightened slightly, her eyes searching his face for answers he did not yet have. "They let you go," she said quietly. "For now," Graham replied, sliding into the booth across from her. "But my dog is still back there." Evelyn's mouth tightened. She glanced toward the front window, then back to Graham, lowering her voice. "You shouldn't be here," she said. "Not tonight, not after what happened." Graham studied her. "You said before they like to remind people they're around. That sounded like experience, not just observation." Evelyn hesitated, then sat across from him, folding her hands on the table. Up close, the lines in her face looked deeper, shaped by years of holding things in rather than letting them out. "People used to complain," she said, "about stops that didn't make sense, about fines that kept growing, about things going missing. Some of them went to the county, some went to the state. After that, they didn't stay in Red Creek." Graham's gaze sharpened. "They moved." "That's what we were told." Her voice wavered slightly. "But they left behind cars, houses, jobs. People don't walk away from their lives without taking something with them." She told him about a mechanic named Paul Richter who had argued with Deputy Dorn over a traffic stop and vanished a week later, leaving his tools locked in his garage. About a young woman, Kara Nolan, who had filed a complaint after her brother was beaten during a search, then disappeared on a drive to see her mother in another town. Each name carried its own small story, and each story ended the same way, with silence and unanswered questions. "We learned to stop asking," Evelyn said, "because asking only made things worse." Graham absorbed the information quietly, his jaw tightening with every word. This was no longer about one corrupt deputy or one frightened dog. This was about a system that had grown comfortable with removing problems. Outside town, headlights cut through the dark as a state trooper's vehicle pulled off the highway and slowed near a dirt turnout. Trevor Miles stepped out, his tall frame silhouetted against the glow of his headlights. At 46, Trevor carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who had spent years in controlled chaos. His hair was dark with streaks of gray at the sides, his face weathered by sun and long hours, his eyes sharp and alert. He wore plain clothes, jeans and a jacket, but the way he moved marked him as law enforcement to anyone who knew what to look for. He leaned against the hood of his car, phone pressed to his ear. "They just moved him from the station," he said. "2 vehicles, sheriff's unit leading." On the other end of the line, a state police captain listened in silence, then spoke briefly. Trevor nodded. "We'll stay back. No lights, no contact until we know where they're going." He hung up and climbed back into the car, easing onto the road at a distance, following the faint glow of taillights far ahead. He did not need to see the driver to know it was Ketter. Small-town sheriffs rarely moved without reason at night, and they almost never moved alone. Back in Red Creek, Graham left the diner with a sense of urgency he could no longer hide. He crossed the street toward his truck when 2 patrol cars pulled in front of him, blocking the path. Sheriff Ketter stepped out of the lead vehicle, his movements unhurried, deliberate. "Change of plans, Mr. Pierce," Ketter said. "We need to ask you a few more questions." Graham did not resist when they guided him into the back seat of the cruiser, but he memorized every turn as the car left town, the familiar buildings giving way to open land and long stretches of unlit road. The air inside the vehicle smelled faintly of leather and radio static. He kept his hands still, his breathing steady, knowing this ride was not about questions anymore. The cruiser turned onto a gravel road, leading toward an abandoned warehouse complex that had once stored equipment for the nearby quarry. The buildings were dark shapes against the sky, their windows broken, their walls scarred by rust and age. Ketter stepped out first, his silhouette sharp under the harsh beam of the headlights. "People get confused out here," Ketter said, his voice calm. "They run, they trip, accidents happen." Graham met his eyes. "And that's your explanation for everyone who never came back?" Ketter's expression did not change. "That's the explanation people accept." He signaled to Doran, who stood nearby, watching with open hostility. The message was clear. This was not an interrogation. This was a warning, and possibly worse. Several miles behind them, Trevor watched the same headlights turn off the main road. His grip tightened on the steering wheel. "There it is," he muttered, easing onto the gravel path at a safe distance. He did not intend to charge in blindly. His job was to see, to record, to understand the pattern before breaking it. He radioed his position quietly, keeping his car's lights off, letting the darkness cover him as he slowed near the tree line. From there, he could see shapes moving near the warehouse, figures clustering around a single vehicle. Back at the diner, Mason sat alone in a booth, phone clenched in his hand, waiting for any reply from his uncle. His leg bounced nervously beneath the table, eyes fixed on the door each time it opened, half expecting to see Graham or a patrol officer coming for him. Evelyn stood behind the counter, pretending to tidy while keeping watch over the quiet room. When Mason's phone vibrated, he nearly dropped it. The message was short. "I see them. Stay where you are." Mason exhaled shakily, relief and fear mixing in his chest. He slipped the phone into his pocket, knowing that whatever was happening now was far beyond anything he could fix himself. At the warehouse, Ketter stood near Graham, the night wind tugging at his uniform. "You understand now," he said. "Red Creek doesn't need trouble, and it doesn't need people who bring it." Graham said nothing, but his eyes tracked every movement, every shift in weight, every distance between bodies. He had learned long ago that silence was sometimes the only way to buy time. Farther back in the darkness, Trevor lifted his binoculars, focusing on the scene, recognizing Ketter and Doran instantly. His jaw tightened. This was not a conversation. This was a setup. He reached for his radio, voice low and controlled. "They're moving him off the books. This is it." The wind carried the sound of footsteps on gravel, of doors opening and closing, of men who believed no one was watching. And in the shadows beyond Red Creek, a line was finally being drawn. The night had grown colder by the time the warehouse lights dimmed and the gravel road fell quiet again. Wind moved through the tall weeds around the abandoned buildings, bending them in slow waves that whispered against rusted metal. Inside one of the sheds near the quarry road, Atlas lay on the concrete floor, his body stiff and aching, ears twitching at every sound. The dim bulb above him cast long shadows across the chain-link panels, turning the small enclosure into a cage of shifting lines. He lifted his head when footsteps approached, hope flickering briefly in his eyes before fading when he recognized the scent that followed. Deputy Caleb Doran stopped in front of the kennel, his face tight with irritation rather than satisfaction now. Up close, the harsh lines of his features were more pronounced, jaw clenched, eyes restless. He had always relied on confidence and fear to get what he wanted, but tonight there was something else in his posture, something sharper and more urgent. He tapped his baton lightly against his palm, then crouched, leaning close to the fence. "You're a problem," he muttered, "and problems don't stick around." Behind him, Sheriff Wade Ketter stood near the doorway, his tall frame half lit by the weak bulb. His expression was calm, unreadable, the look of a man who had made difficult decisions for so long that they no longer felt difficult at all. He did not raise his voice when he spoke. He did not need to. "Make it quick," Ketter said. "No noise, no mess. We don't need more attention than we already have." Dorn straightened, eyes flicking toward the door, then back to the dog. For a moment he hesitated, not out of mercy, but calculation, weighing the consequences of action against inaction. Then he nodded once, sharply, as if confirming an order to himself. Across town, at the edge of the quarry road, a dark transport van waited with its engine idling. Inside, Graham sat with his hands cuffed in front of him, metal biting into his wrists each time the vehicle hit a bump. The interior smelled of oil and dust, the seats torn and patched, the kind of vehicle used more for utility than for people. Two officers sat up front, their voices low and tense, speaking in fragments Graham could not fully hear. He did not struggle. He did not speak. He watched. He memorized the rhythm of the turns, the way the road sloped slightly to the left after the second bend, the moment when the tires hit loose gravel and the van fishtailed just enough to be noticeable. He noted when the driver slowed near the old cattle gate, when the headlights briefly caught the pale trunk of a dead tree by the roadside. Years of training had taught him that even when you were restrained, your mind was not. You learned the path because you might need to reverse it. One of the officers glanced back at him through the metal grid separating the front and back. His name was Aaron Pike, a stocky man in his late 20s with a face that still held traces of youth. His eyes avoided Graham's, and when he turned back to the road, his shoulders hunched slightly, as if he were trying to make himself smaller in his seat. Graham recognized the signs. Pike was not comfortable with what was happening, but comfort had nothing to do with survival in places like this. The van slowed as it neared the warehouse complex again, headlights sweeping over broken fences and abandoned machinery. Graham's pulse remained steady, but his attention sharpened. This was the point where things either ended or changed. Behind the station, in the evidence shed, Dorn unlocked the kennel door. Atlas did not move, though every muscle in his body was coiled tight. His breathing was shallow, his eyes fixed on Dorn's hands. Dorn reached in, grabbed the leash, and yanked, pulling Atlas to his feet. The dog stumbled, claws scraping against concrete, but he did not snap. He had been trained to follow, even when fear screamed otherwise. "Come on," Dorn said, dragging him toward the door. "Let's get this over with." Outside, the night air was sharp and cold, carrying the smell of dry earth and distant rain. Dorn pulled Atlas toward the back of a patrol car parked near the shed, opened the rear door, and shoved him inside. Atlas hit the seat hard, his body sliding against the metal divider, pain flaring through his ribs. He let out a short, broken sound, then went still, chest heaving. Ketter watched from a few steps away, arms crossed, gaze fixed on the road beyond the yard. He was listening, not to the dog, but for any sound that might signal trouble. When the patrol car door slammed shut, he turned to Dorn. "Do it away from here," Ketter said. "We don't need anything connecting back to the station." Dorn nodded again, climbed into the driver's seat, and started the engine. The patrol car rolled out of the yard, taillights disappearing into the darkness. On the road, the transport van carrying Graham followed a different route, heading deeper into the outskirts of town. Graham shifted slightly, testing the cuffs with careful pressure, not enough to draw attention, just enough to understand how tight they were and how much movement they allowed. The metal was old, the locking mechanism worn. He filed the information away without changing his expression. The van slowed again near a narrow bridge that crossed a shallow ravine. The guardrails were bent, scarred by old accidents, and the drop below was not steep enough to be deadly, but steep enough to sell a story. Graham understood the plan now. A crash. A suspect who tried to run. A tragic mistake. In the front seat, Pike cleared his throat. "Sheriff said we take him to the site and wait for further instructions," he muttered to the driver. The driver grunted in response, eyes fixed on the road. "Just do what we're told." Graham leaned back against the seat, letting his head rest briefly against the cold metal. He slowed his breathing, letting the world narrow to distances and angles and timing. If no one came, he would have to act. Not yet. Not until the right moment. Miles away, Trevor Miles eased his unmarked car along the edge of the quarry road, headlights off, guided only by the pale glow of the moon and the faint silhouettes of trees. His jaw was tight, his focus absolute. He had split his attention between two sets of taillights earlier, knowing one would be Graham and the other likely something worse. He had chosen the van. He was betting that the dog was not their only target tonight. He spoke quietly into his radio, giving coordinates and direction, keeping his voice calm and measured. He knew backup was moving, but in places like Red Creek, minutes mattered more than assurances. Back in the patrol car, Atlas struggled to shift into a more comfortable position, pain flaring each time he moved. His ears flicked at every change in engine pitch, every bump in the road. He did not understand where he was being taken, only that Graham was not with him, and that something about the way the human smelled felt final. Dorn drove faster now, impatience edging into his movements. He checked the rearview mirror once, then again, as if expecting to see headlights where there were none. His grip tightened on the steering wheel. "Almost there," he muttered. In the transport van, Graham felt the change in speed and direction. He lifted his head, eyes open now, alert. The road ahead curved sharply, and the van slowed to take the turn. This was the place, the moment when things would either go very wrong or not at all. He flexed his wrists once more, just enough to know he could move if he had to. The two vehicles moved through the dark, one carrying a man marked for removal, the other carrying the evidence meant to disappear with him. Neither knew how close help truly was, only that the night had not yet finished deciding who would walk away from it. The transport van slowed as it reached the edge of the abandoned warehouse yard, tires crunching over loose gravel before coming to a stop beside a sagging chain-link fence. The headlights cut across rusted machinery and collapsed pallets, revealing a place that had not seen honest work in years. Graham felt the change in motion and lifted his head, eyes already tracking the angles of doors, shadows, and distances. The engine idled, vibrating through the metal floor beneath his boots, and for a moment no one moved, as if the night itself were waiting to see who would act first. The driver reached for the door handle, but before he could open it, Graham leaned forward sharply, twisting his wrists in a practiced motion that forced the worn locking mechanism to shift. The cuffs did not fall away, but they loosened just enough to slide one hand free. He surged forward, planting his shoulder into the metal divider and shoving it aside with a force born of timing rather than strength. The driver shouted, the van door flew open, and Graham hit the ground, running before either officer could recover. Cold air burned his lungs as he sprinted toward the dark shape of the warehouse, boots slipping briefly on gravel before finding traction. He did not look back. He did not need to. Every second he gained mattered more than explanations. Inside the warehouse, the air was stale and thick with dust. Moonlight filtered through broken windows, casting pale stripes across the concrete floor. Graham moved through the shadows, following the faint echo of voices and the distant sound of an engine. He kept low, breath controlled, body aligned with the walls as he made his way deeper inside. At the far end of the yard, the patrol car skidded to a stop near the loading bay. Caleb Dorn climbed out first, his movements sharp and impatient. He opened the rear door and reached in, dragging Atlas out by the leash. The dog's legs shook as he hit the ground, but he stayed upright, ears flicking at every sound, eyes scanning the dark for a familiar shape that was not there. "Move," Dorn snapped, pulling him toward the open bay. Atlas resisted just enough to slow them, claws scraping against concrete, pain flaring through his ribs with each step. He did not bite. He did not snap. He simply fought to stay where he was, driven by instinct he could not explain. Dorn swore under his breath and shoved him forward, forcing him into the shadowed interior of the warehouse. He reached for his sidearm, fingers curling around the grip as he yanked the leash tight, jerking Atlas's head up. "This ends now," Dorn said, voice low and tense. Before he could raise the gun, something struck his wrist from the side, hard and precise. The weapon flew from his hand, skidding across the concrete and disappearing into the dark. Dorn staggered back, surprise flashing across his face just before Graham drove into him, shoulder slamming into his chest and sending both of them crashing to the ground. Dorn rolled, scrambling to his feet, but Graham was already moving again, closing the distance with controlled speed. He caught Dorn's arm as it swung, twisted sharply, and drove him backward into a metal support beam. The impact knocked the breath from Dorn's lungs, a harsh sound tearing from his throat as he collapsed to his knees. Atlas stood frozen for a moment, confusion and shock giving way to recognition. He let out a low sound and struggled toward Graham, dragging the loose leash behind him. "Stay," Graham said, his voice firm even as his eyes never left Dorn. Atlas stopped, trembling but obedient, his gaze locked on Graham. Dorn lunged again, rage overtaking caution, but Graham shifted just enough to avoid the blow, then struck once, clean and controlled, dropping Dorn to the floor where he stayed, stunned and gasping, his fight drained in a single, decisive moment. Before either man could move again, the night exploded with light. Headlights flared across the warehouse yard, engines roaring as multiple vehicles surged forward, surrounding the building from every angle. Doors slammed open, boots hit the ground, and voices shouted commands that cut through the darkness with sharp authority. "Police, don't move. Hands where we can see them." Sheriff Wade Ketter stepped into the doorway, his face registering shock for the first time as he took in the scene. He barely had time to reach for his radio before two officers from the state police closed in, weapons raised, their movements practiced, and unmistakably controlled. "Drop it, Sheriff," one of them ordered. "Now." Ketter hesitated, eyes darting between Dorn on the floor and Graham standing over him, then slowly raised his hands, anger and disbelief tightening his features. More officers poured into the yard, securing the perimeter, shouting commands, pulling men out of vehicles, forcing them to the ground. The system that had protected itself for years unraveled in seconds under the weight of real authority. From the far side of the yard, Trevor Miles approached, his expression grim but focused. He moved with the calm efficiency of someone used to arriving at scenes already in motion. His gaze went first to Graham, then to Atlas, and he exhaled slowly, relief flickering briefly in his eyes before discipline took over. "You okay?" Trevor said. Graham nodded once. "He is," he replied, glancing at Atlas. Trevor signaled to a nearby officer who moved quickly to check Atlas, speaking softly, hands gentle as he examined the dog for injuries. Atlas leaned slightly into Graham's leg, exhaustion finally breaking through his discipline now that the immediate danger had passed. Behind them, Ketter was being led away in handcuffs, his badge still gleaming under the harsh lights, a bitter contrast to the reality of his arrest. Dorn was hauled to his feet by two officers, his face twisted in rage and humiliation, eyes locked on Graham with a hatred that no longer had power behind it. Trevor turned to Graham, voice low. "We tracked both vehicles once your kid sent the video. State police were already moving when they turned off the highway. We just had to wait until they showed their hand." Graham let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. "You cut it close." Trevor's mouth tightened slightly. "They always do." Sirens echoed in the distance as additional units arrived, sealing the scene, turning chaos into controlled order. Officers photographed the area, marked evidence, spoke into radios with clipped efficiency. What had once been a place for quiet disappearances was now flooded with witnesses and paperwork and consequences. Graham knelt beside Atlas, resting his forehead briefly against the dog's, his hand steady on the thick fur of his neck. Atlas's breathing slowed, his body still trembling but no longer braced for attack. He let out a long, shaky breath and leaned into Graham, trust unbroken even after everything that had happened. Around them, the night continued, wind moving through weeds, dust settling over tire tracks that would soon be photographed and measured and turned into proof. Red Creek's shadowed system had been dragged into the light, and it would not slip back into silence again. For the first time since he had driven into town, Graham allowed himself to believe that this part of the fight was over. Morning came to Red Creek with a quiet that felt unfamiliar, as if the town itself were unsure whether it was safe to breathe yet. The sky was pale and washed clean from the night before, and the air carried the scent of wet dust and cooling metal. Outside the temporary command area set up near the warehouse, state police vehicles and unmarked federal cars filled the dirt lot, their presence turning a forgotten place into the center of something that could no longer be ignored. Graham sat on the tailgate of his truck, Atlas lying beside him on a folded blanket. The dog's body was wrapped in a light bandage around his ribs, and his movements were slower now, careful, but his eyes were clear and alert. A young veterinarian named Emily Carter knelt beside him, her dark hair pulled back into a loose braid, her face calm and focused. She had driven in from the nearest county clinic when she heard there was an injured dog connected to an active investigation. Emily moved gently, checking the bandages, speaking in a soft voice that Atlas seemed to trust. "He's sore, but nothing looks life-threatening," she said, giving Graham a small, reassuring smile. "He'll need rest, and he won't be running for a while, but he'll recover." Graham nodded. "That's all I need to hear." Across the lot, Sheriff Wade Ketter stood in handcuffs beside Deputy Caleb Dorn, both surrounded by officers who no longer treated them as authority. Ketter's posture remained rigid, chin lifted, eyes fixed straight ahead as if refusing to acknowledge what had happened. Dorn looked very different, his shoulders hunched, his face flushed and tight with anger he could no longer act on. Every movement they made was watched, recorded, documented. Trevor Miles stood nearby with a small group of investigators, his jacket unbuttoned, sleeves rolled up as he spoke to a woman with short blonde hair and sharp eyes. Her name was Agent Laura Beckett, and she had the controlled intensity of someone who had built her career on long investigations that rarely ended cleanly. She listened closely as Trevor spoke, occasionally glancing toward Ketter and Dorn, her expression unreadable. "We've confirmed at least 4 cases where traffic stops turned into disappearances," Trevor said. "Vehicles impounded, personal items logged as evidence, and then nothing. No transfer records, no release paperwork." Beckett nodded slowly. "And the smuggling?" "Connected through the quarry warehouses and county back roads," Trevor replied. "Cash, stolen equipment, and at least one route that fed into a larger operation across state lines." Beckett exhaled quietly. "Then this isn't just Red Creek." "No," Trevor said, "but it started here." Inside the temporary interview trailer, Mason sat across from an investigator, hands folded tightly in his lap. He looked smaller out of his hoodie, shoulders narrow, face pale but determined. The investigator, a woman in her early 40s named Dana Holt, spoke gently, her tone patient and steady. Dana had kind eyes and a calm voice that made people feel safe even when they were being asked difficult questions. "You did the right thing by recording what you saw," Dana said. "I know that wasn't easy." Mason swallowed. "People here don't talk about things. They just pretend nothing's wrong. I didn't want to be like that." Dana nodded. "Your statement and your video, they matter. They help us understand how long this has been going on." Mason took a shaky breath and continued telling her what he had seen over the past year, the stops that lasted too long, the way people stopped complaining after certain names were mentioned, the fear that had slowly settled over the town like something everyone learned to live with. His voice grew steadier as he spoke, as if saying the truth out loud gave it less power to frighten him. At the courthouse later that day, the mood was heavy and charged. Reporters gathered outside, cameras flashing as Ketter and Dorn were led up the steps, their hands cuffed, their badges no longer visible. The charges were read clearly and without ceremony. Abuse of authority, obstruction of justice, conspiracy, multiple counts related to unlawful detention and involvement in organized smuggling. The words echoed through the courtroom, each one another crack in the image Ketter had spent years building. Evelyn Hart sat in the back row, her hands clenched together in her lap. She looked tired, but there was something else there now, too, something like relief mixed with grief. She had known some of the people whose names were being spoken today. She had served them coffee, listened to them talk about plans they would never get to finish. When the hearing ended, she stepped outside into the bright sunlight, blinking as if the world looked too sharp after so much darkness. She saw Graham standing near the steps with Atlas resting at his side and walked toward them, her pace slow but purposeful. "They're finally saying it out loud," she said. "All of it." Graham nodded. "That matters." Evelyn reached down carefully, letting Atlas sniff her hand before resting it gently on his head. Her fingers trembled slightly. "I'm glad he's okay," she said softly. "And I'm glad you didn't leave when you had the chance." Neither of them spoke for a moment. Around them, people were talking, reporters asking questions, officers directing foot traffic, but it all felt distant, like noise from another room. Later that afternoon, Trevor met with Graham near the edge of town, where the road stretched open and empty toward the horizon. The tension in his shoulders had eased, though his eyes were still sharp, still scanning, habit refusing to fade even when the immediate danger had passed. "They're transferring the investigation to a joint task force," Trevor said. "More arrests are likely once they start following the money." Graham rested a hand on Atlas's back, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. "What about the people who disappeared?" Trevor's expression tightened. "We're reopening every case. It won't fix what was done, but it might give families answers, and maybe a little justice." Graham nodded slowly. For him, justice had never been about punishment alone. It was about ending the cycle. Mason stood nearby with Evelyn, listening, absorbing every word. He looked different now, less guarded, as if the weight he had been carrying had shifted just enough for him to stand straighter. "Are they going to ask me to testify?" Mason asked quietly. Trevor met his gaze. "Yes, and you'll do fine. You already proved you're braver than most people twice your age." Mason let out a nervous breath, then nodded. "Okay, I can do that." As evening approached, the vehicles began to thin out, one by one, leaving the town that had suddenly become too visible to hide in. The streets of Red Creek felt strange without constant patrols, quieter but also lighter, like a storm that had finally passed and left the air clean behind it. Graham loaded a small bag into the back of his truck, moving slowly to avoid jarring Atlas. Emily stopped by once more to check the bandages and give a few last instructions, her tone warm and professional, wishing them both well before heading back to her clinic. When the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the road, Graham stood for a moment beside his truck, looking down the main street where the diner sign flickered softly in the fading light. He thought of the names Evelyn had spoken, of the lives interrupted, of how close he and Atlas had come to becoming part of that same quiet list. Atlas shifted beside him, leaning slightly into his leg, reminding him that some endings did not have to be tragic to be meaningful. Behind them, Red Creek carried on, changed in ways that would not be undone easily, but changed all the same. Truth had a way of doing that once it was finally allowed into the open. Morning returned to Red Creek in a way it had not for a long time, quiet without feeling watched, bright without feeling exposed. Sunlight touched the storefront windows and warmed the pavement, and for the first time in years, people lingered on the sidewalks instead of moving quickly from door to door. The air smelled of fresh coffee and cut grass, ordinary things that suddenly felt like signs of something new. Graham stood beside his truck at the edge of the main street, a duffel bag resting in the open bed, Atlas lying nearby on a folded blanket, his ribs still sore, but his eyes clear and curious. He had planned to leave early, before anyone had time to say much, the way he usually did. Staying had never been part of his routine. He was good at passing through, good at helping when needed, and good at disappearing once the immediate danger was gone. That had kept him moving for years, and movement had kept the past from catching up too closely. Atlas lifted his head when footsteps approached, ears angling forward. Evelyn Hart crossed the street toward them, her stride steady, her shoulders squared, in a way Graham had not seen before. She wore a clean cardigan over her blouse, her hair neatly pinned, and there was color in her face that had not been there earlier in the week. In her hands she carried a small paper bag, the top folded neatly. "You were going to leave without breakfast," she said, not accusing, just stating a fact. Graham gave a small, tired smile. "Wasn't sure the diner was open yet." "It is," Evelyn replied, "and it will be every morning if I have anything to say about it." She set the bag on the tailgate and opened it, revealing a few wrapped sandwiches and a thermos. "You shouldn't drive on an empty stomach," she added, her voice softer now. Neither should he. Atlas sniffed the air, tail giving a careful wag. Before Graham could respond, more people began to gather, not in a crowd exactly, but in small, hesitant groups that slowly grew. Mason stood a few steps behind his mother, hands in his hoodie pockets, looking proud and uncertain at the same time. He had slept little, but his eyes were bright, and when he met Graham's gaze, he nodded once, quietly, like someone acknowledging something important without needing to say it out loud. With them was a tall woman Graham had not seen before, her hair pulled into a tight ponytail, her posture straight and purposeful. Her name was Karen Alvarez, and she had been a volunteer firefighter in a neighboring town before moving to Red Creek to care for her aging father. She was in her early 40s, strong and athletic, with a calm confidence that suggested she was used to stepping in when things went wrong. At her side stood a shorter man with sandy hair and kind eyes, named Ben Carter, a former EMT who had taken a warehouse job after an injury ended his field career. He still carried himself like someone who watched for emergencies even when he told himself he no longer had to. Karen stepped forward. "We've been talking," she said, "about what comes next. The county is setting up an interim response team until new officers are assigned, but emergencies don't wait for paperwork." Ben nodded. "Search and rescue, medical response, disaster prep. We can handle some of it, but we don't have formal training." Karen met Graham's eyes. "We heard what you used to do and what you did this week. We were hoping you might consider staying, at least long enough to help us set something up." Graham felt the weight of their words settle in his chest. He glanced down at Atlas, who was watching him closely, as if sensing the question before it was spoken. "I'm not law enforcement," Graham said carefully. "We don't want you to be," Karen replied. "We want you to teach us how to look for people who need help, how to keep ourselves from becoming another name someone whispers about." Evelyn placed a hand lightly on Mason's shoulder. "This town has spent a long time waiting for someone else to fix things," she said. "Maybe it's time we learned how to take care of each other." Across the street, the diner door opened and closed as a few early customers stepped inside. The bell above the door chimed, bright and ordinary, and the sound felt like a promise. Evelyn followed Graham's gaze and smiled faintly. "It's been a long time since I felt good about opening those doors," she said. "But today, I do." Graham took a slow breath. For years, every place he passed through had felt temporary by design. He had never allowed himself to imagine what staying might look like, what roots might feel like after so long without them. But Red Creek was different now. It was wounded, yes, but it was also awake, and there was something about that moment, about these people standing in the sunlight, asking him to help them learn instead of asking him to save them, that shifted something inside him. "I can't promise forever," he said finally. Karen smiled. "We're not asking for forever, just long enough to get started." Graham nodded slowly. "All right, we'll stay a while." The words felt strange in his mouth, unfamiliar and heavy, in a way that was not unpleasant. Mason let out a breath he had clearly been holding, a grin breaking across his face before he could stop it. "I can help," he said quickly, "with equipment, radios, whatever you need." Ben chuckled. "We'll take all the help we can get." Atlas shifted on the blanket and tried to stand, wobbling slightly before Graham steadied him with a hand on his chest. The dog's tail thumped once, then again, stronger this time, as if he understood that whatever came next, it would not be another long drive into uncertainty. Later that afternoon, the group gathered near the edge of town where open land stretched toward the hills. Karen marked off rough boundaries in the dirt with the toe of her boot, talking through possible training areas and supply points. Ben listed medical kits they could assemble from donated equipment. Mason volunteered to set up a communication group, already thinking in terms of channels and backup batteries. Graham listened more than he spoke, offering suggestions when needed, letting them shape the plan into something that belonged to them, not just to him. He showed Karen how to read ground disturbance, explained to Ben how to stabilize someone when help was still far away, and walked Mason through basic radio protocols that could save precious minutes in a real emergency. Through it all, Atlas lay nearby, watching, resting when needed, lifting his head whenever someone moved too close, not out of suspicion, but habit. Several children from the neighborhood wandered over at a distance, curiosity overcoming caution. Atlas watched them quietly until one small boy, no more than 6, took a tentative step forward and held out his hand. Atlas sniffed, then allowed a careful pat, earning a wide smile and a soft laugh that carried across the field. By evening the air had cooled and the sky shifted into deep blues and soft golds as the sun lowered behind the hills. Graham stood with Evelyn outside the diner again, watching people come and go, hearing laughter drift through the open windows. "I used to think this place was just waiting to disappear," Evelyn said. "Turns out it was just waiting to breathe." Graham nodded. "It takes more than one person to change things." "But it takes someone to start," she replied. He looked down the street at the people who had once kept their heads down, now standing in small groups, talking, planning, imagining something better. He felt a quiet sense of belonging settle in, not loud, not dramatic, but steady. Atlas leaned against his leg, warm and solid and alive, and Graham rested his hand on the dog's back, letting himself believe that staying did not mean being trapped, that sometimes it meant choosing where to stand instead of always moving on. As the diner lights glowed against the coming night and Red Creek carried on in a way it had forgotten how to do, Graham knew he would not be leaving tomorrow, and for the first time in a long time, that felt like the right decision. In this story, no one waited for a hero from far away. Change began when ordinary people decided that fear would no longer control them, and when one man chose to protect what was innocent instead of protecting his own comfort. That is how God often works in our lives, not always through sudden wonders, but through steady hearts, brave choices, and moments when we choose love over silence. In our daily lives, we may never face the same danger, but we are all given chances to stand up for someone, to speak when something is wrong, and to be kind when the world feels hard. Every small act of courage can become part of someone else's miracle. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment to remind others that they are not alone. Subscribe to this channel so we can continue spreading stories of faith, justice, and compassion. May God bless you and your family, protect your path, and give you strength when you need it most. And if you believe that God is still working through ordinary people, type Amen in the comments, and let us pray for one another.